Todd DeJernet with SCS Engineers. Thanks everybody for joining our webinar. This is first of two in our webinar series here. And this one is on the impact of the new effluent limitation guidelines, or ELGs, for the meat and poultry producers on food production facilities. So the agenda for the webinar today, the things we'll talk about, we'll start by talking a little bit about what are effluent limitation guidelines, or ELGs, and how they affect industry. We'll discuss the role of the technical development documents in the development of ELGs and the information that's contained in those, why they're important. We'll discuss who is covered in the meat and poultry category. We'll do a brief history of the ELGs for the meat and poultry producers, and kind of how we got to where we are today. We'll discuss the proposed new ELGs and their basis, the implications of those new regulations on industry, and we'll close with some suggestions on how to prepare for the regulatory changes associated with the new ELGs. So to start, just a summary here of what are effluent limitation guidelines, or ELGs. These are national wastewater discharge standards. They're technology-based, that is, they are based on treatment technologies or wastewater management technologies that are used within a given industry. They are industry-specific, so they cover specific processes with certain descriptions that occur within an industry. And they're intended to represent the greatest pollutant reductions that are economically achievable within an industry. Now, there's a lot that goes into that, obviously, we'll talk a little more about the components, but that's the intent. They are incorporated into MPDS discharge permits or pretreatment permits via what is commonly called categorical standards or categorical requirements. As I mentioned, the ELGs live sort of at the intersection of treatment technology that's used in an industry, the impact of the industry on water quality, and the economic impact of any limitations that would be placed on the industry by the EPA. So the balance of all these things and the technical analysis behind that is summarized in what's called the technical development document. So this is what essentially shows all of EPA's homework in developing these ELGs, how they viewed the economics, what they assumed for treatment technology, and as well as the impact on water quality. So a lot of information is contained in the technical development documents. To get into a little more detail on those, as I mentioned, the technical development document is the technical basis for the ELGs. It does a number of things. It defines the subcategories within a given category based on a particular description of the industrial activities that take place. The ELGs are periodically updated, such as the one we'll be talking about today. And those updates may include developing new ELGs based on new data or treatment technology, but also at the same time, which also happens to be the case for the meat and poultry ELGs, they may also incorporate previous development documents by reference. So it's sort of a blend of old and new, if you will, in the technical development document. The way the documents themselves are organized, shown over here on the left-hand side, first, EPA develops a number of regulatory options. So these are different levels of reduction or control of certain pollutants of concern for an industry that come with different treatment practices and obviously costs for the industry. Then from those regulatory options, EPA will select a preferred option. This is sort of a cost-benefit type of analysis that's done. It looks at the incremental capital and O&M costs, at least to the extent that that can be estimated for the industry, in the commensurate impact on pollutant loadings. and other non-water quality based environmental impacts. And then based on that preferred option, then the development of limitations and standards for different categories within the regulated industry. That's based on an assumed performance of the treatment technologies that were the basis for the preferred option. And these result in limitations for both direct dischargers and indirect dischargers, as happens to be the case for the proposed regulations here. And those are distinguished between both existing and new sources. So you have a number of different sets of limitations and pre-treatment standards that are developed as a result of the preferred option within the technical development document. So as it pertains to the meat and poultry processing category, here this is just a graphical representation of the breakdown of that category within the ELG. So the pertinent federal rule here is 40 CFR Part 432. That's the meat and poultry processing point source category. That is broken out into a number of main categories here. Your meat first processors, which would be meat slaughterhouses, small processors that are below the threshold shown there for annual and daily production, meat further processors, which includes quite a variety of different operations there. Renderers, these are folks that take raw materials and render fats and oils from them. And then you have the poultry categories, poultry first processing and poultry further processing. And these are all kind of broken down into different subcategories, A through L. And each of those within the technical development document has a description of the specific activities that take place within those categories. In addition to the small processor category and so the thresholds that apply there, we also have some thresholds that apply to the other categories in terms of how ELGs within those categories are implemented. So for your meat first processors, you have a threshold within that category of greater than 50 million pounds a year live kill weight. For further processors, it's also 50 million pounds a year, but that is finished product. For the renderers, that's 10 million pounds a year of raw material processed. For poultry first processing, it's 100 million pounds per year of live kill weight. And for further processing of poultry, that'd be 7 million pounds of finished product. And so there are some differences within those categories in terms of how the ELGs are applied based on those thresholds. A lot of the numbers and things that we're going to discuss in this presentation really apply to folks that are above those thresholds. But just wanted to kind of make a note that, there are multiple thresholds here in terms of production that are involved. Another item in terms of who is covered, and this is just a table here that is directly pasted in from the proposed rule. Sometimes NAICS codes, so these are codes that are assigned to specific industries. Sometimes those are used as a way to look at categorization of different industrial processes. So here this is showing a number of NAICS codes that are potentially regulated by the proposed rule. Now, potentially is the operative word there. And that's really the point that I want to make with this table is that within here you have some categories, some codes that look like they're probably pretty cut and dried in terms, so meat packing plants, for example, is pretty easy to see how those would be subject to this category. But you have some others in here. I've kind of put some arrows to note them, such as support activities for animal production. Okay, maybe there are some things, some processes within that might fall under this category, but probably most of what is done under that particular industry doesn't apply. And so the point I want to make here is just to be judicious in how you use these NAICS codes, because maybe they're helpful, but you don't want to take too broad of an approach in applying them because you might end up getting swept into a category that doesn't really apply to you. Um, having gone through a few of these things where after the fact you have to go back and sort of unwind a determination that was made based on an NAICS code that resulted in maybe the wrong categorization. A little bit of due diligence on the front end with this is it pays dividends. So just a note on that. A brief history, a simple timeline here for the meat and poultry producers' ELGs. All started back in 1974. This was when the ELGs for subcategories A through D, this is the meat first processors, the slaughterhouses, those were finalized in 74. And we had ELGs proposed for the poultry categories at that time. The next year in 75, we got ELGs finalized for subcategories E through J. So this is your small producers through the renderers. Those were finalized in 75. Then we had a long stretch of time where there wasn't a lot of activity until 2004. ELGs for the meat categories were revised to include total nitrogen ammonia for all direct dischargers except for the small producers, subcategory E. ELGs for the poultry categories were finalized after some time. And at this time, however, no pretreatment standards were proposed for any indirect dischargers. So that's an important point to consider as we talk about the new proposed rule. The next activity was in 2017. EPA conducted an annual review of the ELGs and found that the meat and poultry producing point source category appeared to contribute to some of the highest nutrient loadings for total nitrogen, total phosphorus. And with that rationale, they undertook a more detailed study, which they completed in 2021, where they found that there were revisions to the ELG needed to address nutrients for direct dischargers and for indirect dischargers to address issues with publicly owned treatment works. So this would be things like pass-through or interference due to discharge to local sewer. They found that needed to be addressed in the new ELG, or they need to be updated. And so subsequent to that brings us to current day, where ELG revisions were proposed in 2023. And those, at least as of the latest information I have, are anticipated to be finalized next month. And we'll see how that actually plays out. But that's the current information on the schedule for that. So what are the new ELGs based on? Like we had said, they're based on the technical development document. So within that, you can go in and see that what the assumptions are that are behind the new ELGs. So for direct dischargers, these are ELGs are based on total nitrogen limits for full denitrification. So this would be oxidation of ammonia to nitrate and then subsequent reduction of nitrate to nitrogen gas. So there's a two-step biological process there with different conditions and different bacteria involved. Total phosphorus limits are based on biological treatment followed by chemical precipitation and filtration. So here you essentially the biomass, the bacteria take up as much phosphorus as they need to eat the food that's provided to them, and then any remaining phosphorus you precipitate out with a chemical addition and filter it. Fecal coliform and E. coli limits are based on disinfection of final effluent following biological treatment. So that's usually either ultraviolet filtration or sodium hypochlorite disinfection. For indirect dischargers, now we have some pre-treatment standards for the first time for this group. Biochemical oxygen demand, or BOD, total suspended solids, or TSS, and oil and grease pre-treatment standards are based on screening of solids, and dissolved air flotation, or DAF. This is where you use tiny bubbles to float fat and light solids to surface and skim them off. That's the basis for the proposed pretreatment standards for indirect dischargers. An important thing to note from the technical development document is that the categories here have not changed. They've been incorporated by reference in the current document, and in going through all the other ones, you can see that they've always been incorporated by reference, dating all the way back to the original ELG documents in 74 and 75. And so actually, it's an important point that if you wanted to see what exactly the industrial process descriptions are that are the basis for the categorizations, you'd have to go back to those original documents to find those descriptions. Which is something that I have done, and I'll kind of share that experience with you a little bit later. So here we're back to the different categories and subcategories, and just a graphical summary of what the changes are that could be expected as a result of the proposed ELGs on these different subcategories. This is for existing direct dischargers that are above the production thresholds I talked about before. And here we're looking at the meat processors and rendering. So here we have all the meat first processors, meat further processors and renderers, with the exception of subcategory D. Now, subcategory D, if you read the technical development document, that's not treated any differently than the rest of the meat first processors. But if you go through in detail and read the rule, the draft rule as it's currently published on the EPA website, they actually omitted subcategory D. There's not any changes listed there for it, which I think that could be an oversight. And maybe that will be, remedied in the final rule when it's published. But I just want to kind of point that out as far as right now, that is not really addressed in the draft rule. In terms of the changes, here in the table to the lower right, we have the current monthly average limit that applies versus what's proposed. And you see there for total nitrogen, 134 current to a 12 that is proposed. That's over a 90% reduction. It's very significant. And that's reflective of that two-step process that I mentioned before. And then we have limits for phosphorus, fecal coliform, E. coli that we didn't have before. So these would be new limits that would have to be complied with for those particular parameters. Here for direct dischargers in the poultry categories, the proposed limits are the same, but where we're starting from is a little bit different. So you see there the current monthly average 103 for nitrogen down to 12. So it's percentage-wise maybe not as big of a reduction, but still very, very significant and reflective of having to add some additional treatment steps. And then, of course, you have the new limits for phosphorus, fecal coliform, and E. coli that now apply. For indirect dischargers, here we have uniform pretreatment requirements for everybody except the small processors, and subcategory D only because maybe they got forgotten and left out of the draft rule. But biochemical oxygen demand, or BOD, this is the tendency of the waste to consume oxygen due to biological activity and consumption of organic matter. Total suspended solids, or TSS, and oil and grease. Currently, no pretreatment standards for those, and the proposed 1,300 and some change for both BOD and oil and grease, and 925 milligrams per liter for total suspended solids. And again, these are based on screening of solids and dissolved air flotation technology are the assumed basis for that. So based on, you've seen kind of who this applies to and what the potential impacts are. Question now is, well, okay, what happens next? Well, there's a few different things that happen, now. The first thing is really in terms of preparation. Um, while the rule is federal, it comes down to state and local folks to implement it. And so the first thing is that state and local regulators, pretreatment program managers, and coordinators have to prepare to implement the new requirements. Then the final rule published in the Federal Register. And then as permits are reissued or issued or come up for renewal, then the new limits get implemented in the permits as they're renewed. And then finally, the facilities have to comply with the new requirements in terms of managing their waste, treatment that's required, sampling, and so forth. So I want to talk a little bit in detail about that first step there because that's starting to happen to varying degrees across the country now, and particularly with respect to pretreatment programs. So these would be for indirect dischargers that um, the state and municipal staff are preparing, and as part of that, taking a look at the industrial facilities within their sewer shed and just verifying who's a significant industrial user and who's not. And for those facilities that may be subject to this new requirement, making sure those are in the program, first of all, the pretreatment program, and that could involve issuing new permits or at least updating existing permits to reflect that. Um, and as this takes place, there are a few things that will have to sort of get worked through because the industrial permits incorporate both categorical standards and local limits and local ordinance, um, there's a few things that have to get reconciled within that as the new requirements are implemented. For example, most city ordinances have limits on oil and grease that range from 50 to 200 milligrams per liter, depending on where you are. And that's based typically on grease interceptors, not dissolved air flotation units, but they typically don't really require oil and grease sampling as a result of that. You put your grease interceptor in, you maintain it, use licensed hauler, and that's typically sufficient to comply. Um, one potential item that I thought about here is that the categorical oil and grease limit, which you remember is quite a bit higher than 50 to 200. It's that 1900 number. Um, it might trigger enforcement of the more stringent local limits because those are the ones that are actually on the books in the ordinance. And so at a minimum, the program manager or the city will need to make a decision about what to do with this new oil and grease limit versus what's in the ordinance and uh, how to put that into a permit and then how to document compliance. On the BOD and total suspended solids, most cities have strength surcharges for those parameters. It's not really a limit. It's just, you pay by the pound for how much you discharge to sewer. And these new BOD and TSS categorical limits will have to be reconciled with the surcharge specifications that are in city ordinance. So one potential aspect of this is it may put a ceiling on how much you could actually discharge and then how much could actually be charged for receiving that, based on the new categorical limit. The upshot of all that is that the local folks, both for the industry and with the pretreatment programs, may struggle with implementing this new requirement. And one aspect of that to remember is that this isn't the sort of thing that you necessarily do every day in terms of looking at new categorical limits and how it applies to different categories and who's in what category. As you saw from the timeline, this only happens every other decade or so. So a lot of the city staff aren't really familiar with how to do that, aren't practiced at it, and it may take them some time and effort to try to correctly categorize facilities or processes that may be affected. In addition to that, monitoring can be a challenge, uh, depending on what the plumbing is like. The processes may not be plumbed in such a way that you can get the level of detail in the monitoring on categorical processes that you need. And that can make it hard to demonstrate that you're compliant if you can't get a representative sample. Um, Fat oil and grease in particular, from a sampling standpoint, can be a challenge in terms of getting a representative sample. This is a material that by definition forms separate phases in the water and the liquid phase. So depending on how you dip the sample out or collect it, you can get some variable results on that. So that's something else to be considered when trying to work through this. Some of the other challenges with implementation of the new requirements, we talked about inconsistencies with local sewer ordinance, the impact of BOD and TSS standards on strength, surcharges, and revenue for cities, inconsistencies with local limits for oil and grease, those have to be worked through. Also, in terms of issuing or reopening permits, um, even requirements that aren't directly spoken to in the categorical requirements could come up just by virtue of having to look at the permit again and what is required by ordinance. There are a few examples here of things that might come up yeah, as cities look at permits again. Discharge of contact stormwater to sewer. There's some jurisdictions where that's not allowed. And if that's occurring, then that's something that you might have to address. Some jurisdictions have requirements or restrictions on cooling water that can be discharged to sewer. And then, of course, there's the segregation of sanitary wastewater from processed wastewater. If that's not already done, that might be something that would be required. And so a lot of this, a lot of the implications of this would be really around plumbing. In fact, you might even think of this new ELG as a stimulus program for the plumbing trades in some respects, because a lot of this is going to come down to do you have the plumbing to facilitate it? Um, Adding treatment can have challenges beyond the equipment cost. I know certainly in the technical development document and elsewhere, there's been a lot of discussion already around what type of equipment is needed to treat for these requirements and what does it cost. But what I would put out there is that some of these other factors may actually have a equal or even greater impact to your operation than just the cost of equipment. Integration of equipment into existing facility infrastructure, especially for older facilities, that can be a challenge. Again, that's a plumbing exercise. How do you get the water to where it needs to be in order to put it through the equipment that needs to be there? Also, management of solids and dissolved air flotation materials. These are wastes that will be generated from some of this pretreatment equipment that aren't necessarily generated now. And how will that be managed? And how do you manage any odor issues associated with accumulating and storing that in the process of managing it? And along those same lines, especially for oil and grease and greasy solids, you need to use licensed haulers generally to manage those wastes. And so, what is the capacity within a given region of those haulers and facilities to process oil and grease? Because now you're going to have some additional volume of that material as a result of this requirement, and they're going to need to have the capacity to be able to handle that. And so that would be something to keep in mind as well.
Dr. DeJerna, we have a question related to what you've been talking about on the previous slide.
Okay.
Does the proposed rule take into consideration WWRFs that have already spent money on conveyance and treatment systems to support industry and high strength waste and have in place the infrastructure to support these industries without the limits being put in place. And our attendee says this will have major implications on existing cost structures that
Yeah.
support centralizing the treatment at the WWRF.
Yeah, that's a very good comment. And the answer is I don't think, at least within the technical development document, they didn't get into that level of detail. And but it is an important point that if the facility has made the investment to receive the waste and is recouping some portion of that investment through surcharge fees, and now you have some limits that are going to essentially put a cap on your ability to collect surcharge fees, then you're sort of hung with the cost of the upgrade now, and that's a major issue. That's one of the things that I'm suggesting is I don't know if it's an oversight is the right term, but it's a detail, a major detail that's going to have to get worked through on this because, um, you know, generally speaking, cities, uh, wastewater treatment plants, sewer districts, they take their planning pretty seriously. And when they have an industry that they want to support in their community, they make the investment to do so and, build in a lot of financial assumptions and factors into that. And so this sort of comes in over the top of all that and reshuffles the deck a little bit for some of the facilities. So it is an important point. I don't think that got uh, at least it wasn't documented in the technical development document that I saw that was really considered in any sort of broad basis. It's a good question. So back to sort of those are the issues and challenges, and what can you do to prepare? So here, kind of three different areas I suggest. Know your facility, know your category, and know your local resources. So what might you want to know about your facility? Well, we've talked about plumbing a lot. Document your plumbing. Then that's easier said than done in a lot of facilities, particularly older ones. But where are your tie-ins? What's plumbed to where? If you needed to go and do any segregation of one process area from others, is there a feasible way to do that? Um, Water and materials balance. So here again, where's your water coming from, and how much? Where's your grease and solids coming from? Do you have opportunities to collect those at some point before they blend with other streams or get into the sewer to begin with to make things a little bit easier? Water materials balance generally too is information that cities or pretreatment program managers like to have when they're issuing permits or reviewing them. So it's always a good idea to have that information ready. Current production versus past production. Again, we had the production thresholds, and it may be a foregone conclusion you're already over or under a particular threshold, but um, that's also generally information that the pretreatment program coordinators like to have when they put together these permits. So um, get a sense of where are you now versus where you were before. Do the same thresholds still apply to you? And then operational data, figure this is again kind of hand in hand with the water and materials balance. Where's the grease coming from? Where are the solids coming from? And what's the variation in those loads so that you kind of understand what you're dealing with there. Know your category. We talked some about not painting with a broad brush before, but looking at your processes that you have and what the descriptions are for those versus the ones that are covered in these categories, as defined in the original technical development document, the old one there, um, and figure out which processes you have that are categorical and which ones aren't. And then also, if there are any determinations, say preliminary determinations on your categorical status, they're made by pretreatment program staff or the regulators, make sure you verify those. Like I said, this is not something that people do every day. It's possible to get it wrong. There's a lot of words in the regulation and many different, ways that things are sliced and diced in there. So, make sure you look at that and agree with what category you're being placed in and why you're being placed there. Like I said before, you don't want to get swept into a category where you don't belong and have to try to meet standards that don't apply to you. And last, know your local resources. Again, the city staff or the pretreatment program staff. Who are those folks that are going to be working through this? What are they thinking about how they're going to go about implementing this and how it will affect your facility? Try to get a dialogue going with those folks and be part of that process. And then I mentioned also the licensed waste haulers who provides that service in your region and what is their capacity? What have they thought about, how they're going to accommodate the additional material that's going to result from the new regulation? And are you confident that they'll have the capacity to service your facility when the time comes? That's also um, a good thing to look at from a local standpoint. I mentioned the process definitions, and those go back to the original document. And having gone through this and tried to trace back those categorical definitions, I can tell you it's a little easier said than done. The document here that I'm showing is for the meat products category, but um, it actually, I think, predates the EPA's current document numbering system. So I really struggled to find a copy of it online, and actually ultimately couldn't find a copy online through EPA's various archives and so forth. I had to go down to the university library here, and they had a copy on the shelf. It was a little dusty, but I pulled it out and was able to find all the information I needed. But just a heads up on that it could be a little hard to get your hands on those original definitions just because they haven't really been published again since then, just incorporated by reference in all the subsequent versions of these documents that have been published over the years. Lastly, before we close here, I wanted to give a plug for the second presentation in our series here. So we talked about some of the waste streams new waste streams in many cases that could be generated as a result of this new requirement, the solids and the fat, oil, and grease material. Part two of our seminar series on this has to do with anaerobic treatment of these wastes for heat and electricity generation. So this is sort of a discussion of making lemonade from lemons in some sense. But Dr. Eric Anderson will be presenting on this topic. He's an expert in this area. And he'll be talking about new opportunities for on-site waste management by pairing that with renewable energy production. He'll talk about biogas potential for thermal energy and electricity generation and the production of renewable natural gas, and how meat processing and slaughterhouse waste can be ideal feed substrates for anaerobic digestion to fuel these processes. So that's on August 21st. So be sure to mark your calendar for that and dial in so you can learn a little bit more about those opportunities. And that brings us to the end of the webinar presentation here on this topic. I thank everybody for your attention. I've pasted the draft rule citation there if you want to go and read it for yourself and see if you can find that subcategory D. If you find that, drop me a note maybe and let me know where it is because I didn't see it. If you have questions or comments, use the Q&A icon and we'll run through those and answer them as we receive them. And if you have any follow-up questions or want to discuss anything further, my contact information is there. That's my phone number and email address. Use either, and I'd be happy to chat more with you as you like about it. And with that, I don't know, Diane, if we have any questions,
We certainly
we
do.
can look.
Thanks, Dr. DeJernet. Couple of questions here. On the preparation side, the steps to prepare you had,
Uh-huh.
are most of those things covered in a feasibility study? And
Yes,
during a feasibility study, or maybe some investigation into, what technology is already being used, and being technology agnostic, an environmental engineer could perhaps recommend an additional technology or system that could integrate with what a company already has. Is this also a good time for an energy and particularly a water audit to help defer costs?
yeah. So really, when you talk about feasibility study and trying to compare, if we're talking about treatment alternatives, or I would even just say compliance alternatives, and maybe make it broader than that. Um, I think that the things you're talking about, water audit, the water and materials balance, and some of these other preparatory items really form the basis for that evaluation. So you really want to make sure that the alternatives that you're looking at account for all of the specifics with respect to the facility, particularly with the plumbing and what's feasible to plumb into a certain area, and then your loads and where they're coming from, all of that would factor into a robust feasibility study. So that would be the answer, I guess, would be yes to that question.
Okay, thank you. Uh, you talked earlier about the impact on local effluent limitations, based on the federal proposed rules. You're seeing that mostly through permitting or at the time of renewing permits. Is there any other indication besides that across the country or with your clients?
Yeah, so not, I would say we're seeing some activity even before the issuance of permits or renewal of permits, where, again, it's related to that step of, do we have everybody in the program that will need to be in the program in order to implement these new requirements? So the significant industrial user determinations and things of that nature, that we're seeing some of that take place at state and local levels. So it's really, in advance of any new permits, because you can't get a limit in a permit until the rule is finalized, right? So it won't be rolled into actual permits as limits until after they finalize the rule, which presumably will happen next month. And then you have a period of time before different permits come up for renewal, and would include any new limits resulting from that.
Okay, and that segues very nicely into my final question, which is there any indication on the time to comply? We know from an industrial point of view that the response period was extremely short. We know there are issues with some of the science that EPA claims behind it, and we know that they have reached out to get more details, but even those, the EPA reaching out, I think we're almost to the end of those deadlines as well. So I'm not really asking, do you think this will happen in August or not? I guess what I'm asking is, if it does happen, how long will, do you suspect it will, what's the time to comply?
Yeah. So, you've got a couple pieces to that. One is the regular permit renewal cycle. So, different facilities are at different points in the permit renewal cycle. That may be 3 years or 5 years, kind of a cycle. So, you know, at a minimum, before you would actually see any limits, you'd have to go through the end of whatever cycle you're currently in. And then at that point, you'll have the limits. And typically, when implementing new limits, you get some compliance. Oftentimes, you get a compliance schedule or other accommodations within the permit that give you some amount of time to come into compliance. You're not expected to flip a switch and comply overnight, or at least that's the way that it should work. When these things are reissued. So that too can vary depending on what jurisdiction you're in. But I think most cities, most municipalities, even most state programs acknowledge that in order to have a proper and robust compliance system in place, you have to take the time to select it, to design it, to install it, to get it up and running and optimized. So there will be some time allowed, but we can't put a specific time frame to it. But it will vary depending on your facility and where you are.
Mhm. Well, under the current administration, I'm seeing a lot of Clean Air Act deregulation or um, even some substances being pulled back or no longer need for monitoring. But I'm not seeing very much as far as the Clean Water Act. Um, so that makes me wonder if it makes it more likely that this will move forward.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know. I guess, whether you're the government or an individual person, there's only a certain amount of bandwidth to pay attention to things and issues, right? So when whether you're talking about enacting new regulations or rolling back existing ones, you're going to have some, priority, or you must, because you can't do everything at once. And so while some of these things that have been done obviously were a priority, we don't know where this particular issue or Clean Water Act in general would fall as a priority for anybody that would be looking to roll something back or to sort of ease regulatory requirements. So that's once again that's sort of a guess as well.
But thank you again for taking the time to join us. And if after you digest some of this information, as Dr. DeJarnett stated before, you can submit any questions to us and I will make sure he gets those and we respond to them immediately. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Goodbye.
Bye bye.